Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Future States Focus. My name is Joseph Orosco. I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project at Oregon State University. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that try to imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. And one of our projects that we're working on right now is this series called Future States Focus. It's co-hosted by my co-host here, Robyn Morris. Hey, Robyn.
Hey.
What we're trying to do with this series is to do a deep dive examination of episodes in the PBS series Future States, which premiered on various PBS stations in the United States from between 2011 to 2014. It had about 5 seasons. And Future States was an opportunity for different filmmakers to provide short films that tried to imagine the United States in a series of different kind of future vignettes with a kind of speculative fiction focus and looking at different ways in which the United States might change for the better or for the worse. A lot of the episodes have a kind of dystopian feel. So as the ways I've been sort of explaining it is imagine Black Mirror with a kind of social justice focus. So today, the episode that we're going to be looking at is from season 5, episode number 7, called Excarcerated. And so I just wanted to sort of say why I decided to go with this one real quick. I was looking over the news the other day, and I found an Associated Press poll having to do with police reform and police abolition. Of course, we're in this moment where, you know, in some places like near where we are in Oregon, right, 54 or more days of police protests, riots and protests against police violence. And so the Associated Press did a poll in June asking Americans about their views about police reform. And there's a variety of different outcomes of it, but one of them was that overwhelmingly a number of Americans think that some kind of reform to the criminal justice system is necessary. And what was interesting, though, was when folks were asked, do you believe that the criminal justice system needs a systemic overhaul? There were some really sharp differences. 57% of Black Americans believe that some kind of major systemic overhaul of the system is needed, while only 26% of white Americans think that there's some kind of systemic overhaul needed. Overwhelmingly, there's a belief that there needs to be some change in terms of things like reforms for police in terms of body cameras or changes in use of force rules and things like this. But when you ask folks about systemic overhaul, there's a real wide disparity in terms of people who believe that the system needs change. And so Excarcerated is an interesting film because it takes on this question of what do we mean when we talk about criminal justice reform, reforming the police, changing what we mean by the criminal justice system. So I think that it was appropriate for us to sort of talk about this episode today in the midst of all of this kind of change going on. So how are you doing, Robyn?
I'm good. Good. Happy to be here.
Good. Let me talk a little bit about what the background to this episode, and then you can sort of give us a summary of what the episode is about for those of us who, for those viewers and listeners who haven't had a chance to see it. So, Excarcerated is, as I said, from season 5, the last season actually of Future States. There weren't very many of these done, and so it ended in 2014. The director for Excarcerated was Aldo Velasquez, and he was a Mexican-born director from Guadalajara, Mexico. And something that was interesting that I found out about him in his background was that in addition to his filmmaking, he was is a private investigator, right? So I thought this was an interesting fact about him, is that he has direct experience with the working within the criminal justice system. And even more than that, his work as a private investigator has been really important. He apparently was the private investigator who was hired in a famous case of a young man by the name of Mario Rocha. Mario Rocha's story was the centerpiece of a documentary that came out, I believe, in 2007, 2009, somewhere around there. But the documentary is called Mario's Story. And so what happened in this case was that a young man was convicted for murder in a really kind of convoluted case in which someone ended up dead at a party, and there were drugs involved and all this kind of stuff. And it was very unclear who was responsible for the murder, but it was pinned on this young man by the name of Mario, and some witnesses put him at the scene. But as it turned out, through the work of Aldo Velazquez, it turned out that he had been framed for this murder and was eventually exonerated. So I think that his experience in this case as a private investigator sort of plays into what you see in Excarcerated. In terms of the background of the actors for this, the main character is portrayed by Wilmer Calderon, who has gone on to some really interesting work. He was in this series on Amazon Prime called Bosch. Did you ever watch this, Robyn? I've never heard of this series,
You
Bosch.
know, Michael has, and he loves it. He
Really?
thinks it's, yeah, he absolutely loves it. I guess it's a story of like a police officer who's sort of that rogue type police officer that, you know, we all love to watch stories about, who says, you know, F the rules and I do whatever I want.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
he apparently has a role as an agent in that several episodes in that series. He was in Lucifer, another show that I
Oh,
never watched, and then had a reoccurring role in Agents of Shield.
oh,
So
interesting.
yeah, so he's gone on to do a variety of different things. The Excarcerated also features the work of Miguel Sandoval, who is a really prominent Latino character actor. He plays the dad
Mm.
in this episode, and you know he's done a lot of different kind of character acting. He's a very sort of recognizable face. And the sister of the murder victim in Excarcerated is portrayed by Olivia Sandoval, and then she went on to have several episodes in Fargo. So a lot of these folks have gone on to do some interesting work. But I thought that this question about Aldo Velazquez's ties to thinking about the nature of guilt and innocence in the criminal justice system because of his private investigation work really does sort of play into what goes on in the story of Excarcerated. So, Robyn, could you help us understand like what this story is about?
Sure. So when the film opens up, we open up on Javier Wilson, who is our criminal, right? And he is in this program. It's called Excarceration, which is essentially a 24/7 work release. We might think about from an actual prison. So they let these people out of prison, and what they do all day, every day is well, what Javier does is he works in a park and he does cleanup at this park, right? One of the first things you notice is that Javier has an implant in his eyes, which will, when you look at it through his view, he gets instructions through it, and he can also see his prison guard, right? And his prison guard is always sort of there and watching what he's doing. These implants, we find out later in the film, can also cause blindness and pain if he does something he's not supposed to be doing. The park that he's working at overlooks the home of the victim of his crime. So we do find out that his crime was a killing of some kind. He says that it was an accident. The victims call him a murderer, and we don't really have the details, but it is clear that it was one of his very good friends that died. So anyway, the park overlooks the home of these people, of the father and the sister that are still living. And he's working, and then he sees this sign, and it says that the mockingbirds are gone, right? And this is sort of a side thing that's happening throughout the film, is this idea of the mockingbird. And you get these flashbacks of him when he was a child looking out the window at night and wondering, you know, what bird is that? Why is it making these noises? And his mother, you hear, says, oh, that's the mockingbird, and he's dreaming. That's why he's making those noises. He's dreaming about a better future, right? So Xavier feels terribly about whatever it was that he did. Again, we don't know what that is. And he tries to go down and give a letter to the father of the boy who died. And he is made blind by his implants, and it's a very contentious sort of interaction. And then his prison guard says, okay, well, now you're restricted. You can't even cross this street, right? Anyways, he realizes that the sister of his friend is the one who's putting up all these signs about the mockingbird being gone and about her brother, Sam, who is passed. So Xavier goes around and he takes all these signs in order to lure Brenda, that's her name, to him. And Brenda ends up saying, look, you can't make what you did right. You murdered my brother. He says it was an accident. She says it doesn't matter by your choices. My brother is dead, right? And then she says, maybe if you could give us back a piece of him, something would be different, but you can't. And this sort of sparks a plan for Xavier. Xavier gets somebody to tie rope on the street all the way down to these people's house so that when he goes blind, he has a way to get there. And then he goes to his home and he gets a guitar. So he goes to the house, he's blind, you know, the father is very upset and he says, please just take this guitar. The father's like, it's just a toy. And it turns out that actually his son Sam used to play on this guitar, and it would record everything that Sam would play and sing. And so Javier's trying to sort of give that piece back to the family of Sam. Anyway, all of this is happening while, you know, police are showing up, and you can hear a helicopter coming for him because his prison guard has said, like, I'm calling the patrols on you. You're going back to prison. Well, it turns out that the family specifically asked that Xavier not be put back in prison, but they don't ever want to see him again. And the prison guard gives him sort of a pep talk towards the end and says, you know, Xavier says, I just wanted to do something good. I wanted to like make it right in some way. And the prison guard tells him, find another way. So Xavier decides that he's gonna, you know, take care of this park and it's gonna be his thing. And as the film closes, the mockingbird sings, right? So the mockingbird sort of comes back. And that's the film.
You know, it's a very short film. It's only about 15 minutes or so. A lot of tension packed into it.
Yeah.
And a lot of symbolism going on, which I still haven't really made a lot of sense of. But the mockingbird as a symbol of a better future at the end is really kind of ingenious, right? As an attempt to try to figure out like what can give this guy who's in prison hope.
Right.
But the part, you know, like I said at the beginning, what part of what was interesting to me about this is that I think it raises some questions about what we want from prison reform.
Mm.
right? So in the United States, we have the largest incarceration rate in the world, right? Even though we're only about 5 to 6% of the world's population, we have almost
25%.
25, yeah, 25%. So an enormous amount of our people, millions of people in prison. And so a lot of people have been saying, look, we got to do something about this. And so this film sort of addresses this kind of question, right? And we've seen this happen in California in the past, say, decade or so of trying to figure out how to reduce incarceration rates. The Supreme Court ruled a few years ago that, just warehousing people in prisons was a violation of the Constitution. And so California had to release a bunch of people who were primarily nonviolent offenders. But, right, this is a real big problem. And so, right, here's a kind of technological fix, right? The sort of the Black Mirror aspect, right, is that, well, we have people in prison, but we can't warehouse them. So let's put an implant in their brain so that we can follow them around and they can do work in the community, but we won't be responsible for having them in these warehouse-like conditions.
Right.
So they're excarcerated. But what's interesting to me about this film is that it suggests that you can have these kinds of reforms but still not achieve some kind of notion of justice, right? There's still something left undone even if you get rid of the prisons, or you put the prison at least in the hearts and minds of the prisoners in the kind of like Foucault kind of sense.
Right, right. It's sort of okay there, and that's what struck me is what's actually different than being in prison with this excarcerated program. I mean, sure, you're not in an 8 by 10 cell 24 hours of the day, right? Or 23. Um, but at the same time, you still have that notion of like the polynomicon, right? Like that constant surveillance. I, and then it brings up notions of, is it even right to implant people with things that allow us to watch them all the time? I don't know. It seems so, and I hate to keep saying this, but it seems so unimaginative, right? And when we're talking about prison reform, to just say, okay, well, we'll just put you in prison out in the world
Mm.
then, right? A prison is so much more than just the four walls within which somebody lives. So it seems like a new iteration of the prison.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I mean, if you think about like what Michel Foucault does in Discipline and Punish, right, is sort of giving the history of criminal reform and punitive reform, right? That the prison was actually meant to be a much more humane way of dealing with criminal justice, right? So rather than sort of corporal punishment or public floggings or executions or things like this, you create this kind of place in which the penitentiary, right, where the criminals can go,
Penitent.
yeah, can go be penitent and think about their crimes and repent. And it was meant as a, right, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of the prison was considered to be a more humane way of dealing with prisoners rather than dungeons, or just
Mm-hmm.
outright killing them. And so now we're faced with the reality that we have these major social institutions in our country in which millions of our fellow citizens are uh, uh, imprisoned, right? And we recognize that it's a problem. And so what do we do? And so one solution here is like, let's use technology and create this excarceration program. But I mean, it sort of fits, like you've been saying, right? It would fit in that kind of story that Foucault was saying, is that really, this is just another way of gaining control over people's bodies and now their minds, right? The
Mm-hmm.
cop is literally in your head. And so you
Right.
can't see anything that he doesn't see. You can't think anything that he doesn't see. And so, it's that sort of idea of total and complete control is there. So the body is free, but really, how free are people? And is this really a kind of reform?
Right.
So yeah, I think you're right, is that it's another sort of iteration of a story. And that's why I think that, the deeper sort of story here is this kind of question of like, well, what do we, when we think about systemic change for the criminal justice system, what are we looking for? It's not just simply blowing down the walls of the prisons, but doing something different with people and doing something different with violation and violence and crime. Um,
Right.
so, one thing I was looking at, um, uh, in thinking about police and prison abolition in this moment that we're in, I was looking at the work of the group Critical Resistance that was started in 1997 by Angela Davis and
Mm-hmm.
Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and this is one of the sort of really big prison abolition organizations in the country, and their motto is dismantle, change, and rebuild. And so this seems to, part of what they want to do is to sort of think about like doing the overhaul, but right, as the language suggests, changing it in a way and rebuilding it. And so part of what their work is about too is thinking about different kinds of justice,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we need to think about the criminal justice system in a different kind of way, so that, right now what we have is a really sort of punitive system that says that if you do the crime, you have to do the time. And so there's this kind of equation that's a really ancient equation, really, of crime, punishment.
Right.
And the punishment is meant to be a kind of rehabilitation of the prisoner. And it may or may not give healing to the victim if the victim is still alive, or the victim's family. But the real focus isn't really on that. It's more on the punishment of the offender.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be, that equation of crime and punishment seems to be what's being questioned in this film, right? Is that
Right.
is that really justice? Because Javier Wilson feels that, he might have been responsible for the death. He didn't mean it; it was an accident. But nonetheless, right, he's held responsible by the laws of society. But we feel that there's not really any kind of justice being done here, because he feels dissatisfied, and really, truly, the victim's family, the Galindos, they feel unsatisfied too,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're not healed, right, in any kind of way. So, what does that mean then? Like when we're thinking about systemic overhaul of criminal justice, like what would it mean to sort of focus on healing?
Well, I think that's a great question. We have to, it's like what you said, this connection between wrongdoing and punishment is so deeply rooted, I think, in the human psyche. I mean, it goes back to what the law code of Hammurabi, right? And this is ancient, ancient stuff. And it's been sort of reiterated over and over and over again. And I think that's what makes it so hard to imagine something different. Um, but I think the first step has to be deciding what the end goal is
Mm.
of any kind of justice system. Like, what do we want from a justice system? What do we think should be the goal for that justice system, right? And for me, I tend to think that we should want the kind of justice system that heals victims, or at least helps them to move forward with their life in a really meaningful way, and tries to help perpetrators or people who commit crime to find a better way to live within society, right? To help them with whatever it is that's, because people don't generally, I mean, sure, there are people who have mental illness that just go out and commit crime for the hell of it. But generally, people aren't out committing crime just because they woke up that morning and they thought, I'm going to go rob a bank, or I'm going to go and, drunk drive, or whatever it is, right? Something led to that moment. And I think we as a community can help people with those things and reintegrate them into community, build those bonds back up to where, they can function in society. As we have it right now, even those people who do change their life in prison, which is not a lot, right? It's something like half of the people who go to prison will reoffend, right? So the half that don't ever reoffend again and change their life and make better choices in the future, even they will have this sort of thing following them around for the rest of their life because of the way the felony system works, right? So even then, we say, you haven't paid your, we say, we love to say in the United States, do the crime, do the time, and then sort of you paid your debt to society or whatever. But have they really?
Yeah, which is not true, because after you do your time, then you have all these restrictions on your freedom, depending on where you are.
Right. To the point where you're almost not even a citizen anymore, right? Because you can't vote. And it's like voting and being on a jury are the only things that set you apart from a non-citizen in this country. So, and nobody wants a felon on a jury either, right? So, I mean, it's just, I think the first step has to be defining what the goal should be. What do we want? What does justice even mean? Right? Because there are, philosophically speaking, there are many notions of justice, what justice means. And we as a society have to come together and go, okay, this is the kind of justice that we want. This is what we mean by justice. And then go from there,
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of represented in the film too, because Wilson, you sort of get, this is never explicit, but the way that he interacts with his parents, it seems as though he was probably a drug addict, right? Because when he comes back to his family's house, his parents are really, they don't let him in the house, right? They don't even open, his mother doesn't even open the door for him, and he says, look, I'm not here for money. So he's had this relationship with him where they're it's clear that he was always coming around and begging for money, probably to get a fix or something or other. And apparently, like the killing of Galindo seems to have been taken place in some kind of drug frenzy or something or other. So maybe they were running buddies in some way or another.
Maybe he overdosed.
Or maybe he, yeah, that's good. That's a good question, right? So it's sort of unclear here what happened. And as you were pointing out, it seems as though that part of what the prison abolition movement has been talking about is that we need to put less emphasis on the criminal justice system and more on support services for people who are not necessarily like the diehard serial killers, right? Most of the people who are in prison are there for a variety of different kinds of nonviolent crimes, usually drug crimes, right? Less and less so now nowadays, but still, at least at the federal level, quite a few. But a lot of people who probably did crimes under the influences of various kinds of intoxicants, or had to do various kinds of property crimes because of poverty and things like this. So, there's a lot of circumstances behind the story that led to people being injected into this criminal justice system that punishes them in a way. And so groups like Critical Resistance are saying, look, we need to sort of focus on the support systems that would, get people in quality of life way so that they would not engage in activity that would round them afoul of the law, right? This is like one of the ways that Critical Resistance talks about this, as you're saying, different notions of justice. They call this transformative justice. Like, how can we think about our society and creating a helping society, a society that cares, so that we prevent crime, and particularly violent crime, from taking place. And there's so many things that we can do here by focusing on mental health care, economic justice, so that we sort of cut off the supply chain to the criminal justice system in this kind of way. And you see that sort of played out, I think, in this episode, because it doesn't seem as though Wilson was right. He himself feels that this was an accident and that he didn't intend for his friend Galindo to die. And nonetheless, right, the system that he's been put in place doesn't give him any kind of rehabilitation, nor does it give his family any kind of sense of healing either, right? More needs to be done. And as you were saying, right, the more that needs to be done seems to be this kind of thing that his family wants to be, you know, they want Sam Galindo brought back.
Mm-hmm.
And that can't happen. But he brings a piece, right? Wilson brings a piece, which is the recording of him playing the guitar. And that's a really, it's a kind of a touching scene, right? Where the guitar is this kind of, it has this sort of built-in recording system. So this is, again, that part of that sci-fi technology thing, right? Where, you know, he's able, the guitar records whoever's playing on it and singing on it. And so when Wilson gives the father, Mr. Galindo, the guitar, right, his face changes because he can hear his son singing.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, right, that, you know, he always, the father told Galindo, right, that being a
It's a
musician
waste of time.
was a waste of time. But now it's the one thing that still connects him to his dead son. And that's a really sort of poignant moment, but that's what they wanted back. They wanted that, they want that kind of
Connection.
connection. And the punishment of Wilson didn't do that for them.
Right.
Right, that it didn't solve that kind of pain. So I think you're right, is that we need to figure out, like, how do we focus on this question of prevention on the one hand, which is that sort of the piece of the puzzle of transformative justice. But then, right, critical resistance also talks about this other kind of justice, which is the restorative justice, right? Is how do we focus on, right, once violence has been done, once harm has been perpetrated in a community, how do we heal? How do we, in some ways they talk about this making whole again,
Right.
and that this is a different kind of justice that our system right now doesn't touch on at all, right? And so these two kinds of justice, transformative and restorative justice, are pieces that the criminal justice system just doesn't deal with in any kind of way at all.
Right.
But, you know, what do we mean by restorative justice? I know that you and I have talked about this kind of thing, and the language of restorative justice is very frequently this kind of thing about, like, you know, making whole again. But I know that you have some reservations about that language.
I have reservations about language in general. Right? No language seems to really capture always what we mean, right? You know, I like the language of healing, and you have reservations about that. And I guess my concern, and it's not really my concern, I'm just sort of anticipating a concern of other people, is when you have crime like murder or rape, or child molestation, right? A crime that really changes the victim, for the foreseeable future, probably for the rest of their life. I think the sense of wholeness doesn't play, right? Like, people are never going to feel whole again, in those types of crimes. But I think that can be, and I worry about these things, language, because we see so often today that language really can obscure a movement, right? How many times do we see people taking issue with Black Lives Matter just because of that language, right? So for me, I try and think of ways to like circumvent those arguments before they even start to happen, right? Because I can imagine a victim saying, don't talk about wholeness because I'll never be whole again, right? And that's valid. I don't want to say dismiss that sort of thing. It's valid. I just worry. It's just something I worry about.
Yeah, I mean, even now, with all the different movements that we're seeing around, there's all these kinds of questions about, like, what exactly are we seeking? Are we seeking to disarm the police, defund
Yeah.
the police,
Yeah.
abolish the
What does
police?
defund mean?
Right, right. This is all so confusing in this kind of way. And so, I mean, I think that I think you're right. The question about, like, you know, what does restorative justice mean? Is it a healing, and what does that involve? You see that in the film, right, where, as you pointed out, at the end, Brenda and Mr. Galindo, they don't want Wilson put back in physical prison so he can
Right.
remain excarcerated, but they stipulate they don't ever want to see him again.
Hmm.
So they don't want connection with him in any kind of way, but they recognize that he tried to make something better, right? He
Right.
tried to bring a piece back of their family member to them, and so they don't recommend that he be put back into prison. And so there's this kind of healing that goes on in a kind of way, right?
Or at
And
least the door seems open to it,
yeah, yeah.
right?
And for him too, because at that point he realizes that what he wants is a kind of, as I think he puts it, right? He says he wants to make the world a better place than he found it, right?
Right.
And so that's why he focuses on this question of legacy, right?
Hmm.
Which is interesting, right? Because he says he wants to plant some trees, right? So in the park, he says he wants to plant some like orange and lemon trees or something or other.
Hmm.
And the prison guard says, like, why are you doing this? This is like stupid. You'll be out of prison by the time those trees are, able to,
Who's going to water them
yeah,
after your prison sentence is over?
who's going to take care of them all? And he says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to commit to it. My purpose will be in leaving these trees here because of just the sheer beauty of it. So,
Mhm.
right, there is this kind of opening for a better future in a kind of way, what that will be, looks like, or whatever. But, the one thing that's important is that it wasn't the system that created that opportunity,
Right.
right? And it only happened by accident. That sort of raises the question, like, what does it mean to have a system that creates that kind of opportunity for healing? And we've talked about this before too. The big sort of kind of experiment with this stuff is what happened in South Africa after the fall of apartheid with Desmond Tutu's Truth and
Truth and
Reconciliation Commission.
reconciliation.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. And so this has become a big model for what restorative justice might mean. And, for those of you who don't know about this, right, after the fall of the white supremacist apartheid government in South Africa in 1994, there was this question of how do people who for decades have been fighting and dying in a civil war, essentially, how do they now take up their identities as citizens together, or equal citizens of a society, knowing that there's been so much violence and that many of the perpetrators of harm against them are living among them. And so there was just simply too many people involved in violence to be able to prosecute everyone through the criminal justice system. So what they did, and this is a process that's been done in other places where there's been enormous violence, like in Rwanda after the genocide
Hmm.
there in 1994. But there's also experiments with something like this now going on, particularly in California, with this system called neighborhood courts. But the idea is, right, is that you give a perpetrator, someone who is accused of doing violence, you give them an opportunity to, in public, sort of talk about the harm that they committed. And in the case of the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission, right, often you had the victims' families there, and in public testimony you said, look, on such and such a date I walked into this place and I shot up everyone, or I threw a
Hmm.
grenade in, this is what I did, this is what I know. And you had to do that right in front of the families of the victims. In the neighborhood courts, that the system that's in place in California now, you do a similar kind of thing, that for some kinds of low-level nonviolent crimes, robbery, property theft, and stuff like this, you meet with the people that you violated and you have a talk about what you did. And as Desmond Tutu says, the kind of moral thing that was going on here was an opportunity for forgiveness,
Hmm.
right? So that's for him, at least for Tutu, the healing part is that question of forgiveness, is that upon hearing of a perpetrator admit that they did this, the victim then has the opportunity, not the responsibility, right? So you don't have to forgive anybody, but you may be moved to forgive the person that harmed you. And the way that he talks about this is that forgiveness is a kind of power that you have. The victim, Tutu says, has the power to bring that person back into the human community. and say, look, I'm not going to forget what you did. I'm not ignoring what you did. In fact, I'm thinking about it constantly, and I'm putting you on notice here that I forgive you, which means that not that what you did was okay again, not a pat on the back, Tutu says, but it's an acknowledgement that I'm in the position to decide whether or not you can come back to us.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that's the power of restorative justice, is that sort of that healing moment of saying to the person who did harm, you can get on with your life as I will get on with my life. We can never be whole again, but we can start building once again. And this has been controversial, right? This is a controversial kind of thing, because part of it is, like in the case of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you were talking about murder, rape, assault, and things like that, some really heinous kinds of things. The neighborhood courts are mostly sort of low-level crime. And there's question about whether it can be for the kinds of crimes that you were talking about, the really heinous kinds of things that really damage survivors in big psychological and mental ways. But it's this kind of, it's this issue of, like, this moment of power of the victim to forgive that apparently Tutu says is the power of restorative justice. um, what do you think about this idea?
I think anybody who's been really hurt by somebody, or yeah, I mean, just anybody who's had to forgive a big thing, knows the power of forgiveness, right?
Mm,
I have had to forgive people for stuff that just is terrible, and I tend to agree with Tutu, right? That it's not just the power to say you can come in back into the fold, but it's also the power to say I'm not going to allow what you did to continue to hurt me,
mhm.
right? Um, so it's also a sort of self-affirmingness that happens. Um,
And that's a big thing, right? Because
right,
that's again something I think that, the film Excarcerated explores, that the system, even a reform system like the excarceration system, doesn't give people, because people can't have that moment. The Galindo family is broken by the death of their brother and their son, and they can't really. They seem to sort of get by, but you can tell that, right, the father said, and the Brenda, right, because of the fact that she's putting up these signs throughout the whole neighborhood, she's
right,
broadcasting her pain, and so they obviously can't get past it in some way. And so
right.
what you're saying here is this opportunity to sort of heal in this way, and to say, look, I'm gonna not let this hurt me in the same way anymore. That's a big deal.
Well, I mean, and that sort of trauma, that sort of pain, it holds people back in life. It really does. And so yeah. And that's why I said any sort of criminal justice system that we reform into has to have those systems that support and protect victims of crime, um, to help them move on too, right? It's got to be this sort of, we need to focus on the person who's doing these and focus on the people who've been hurt, and try and balance that, into a way where the whole community can move on, because a community is hurt either way, right? If you just have the perpetrator, if you just have the victim, that community is suffering, right? From both sides. So it's important to balance those things. I agree with Desmond Tutu, but like you said, I want to make sure that we're not running around telling people that they have to forgive the people that have hurt them, right? Because that's not our place. That's definitely like a personal thing that happens within all of us. And we can't just like expect that of people, but we can hope it for people, because that means then that they are healing too.
Yeah, I mean, a lot is sort of built into this idea. There's a lot of expectations both on the victim and the perpetrator. Like you were saying, right? Tutu points out that, people shouldn't be expected to forgive, and he admits that some people didn't forgive in the Truth and Reconciliation process. As some families decided, look, I don't want to forgive you for what you did. But, you know, on the other opposite side of this, right, which is important too, that I didn't mention, is that Tutu says that the perpetrator, in order to be honest in this situation, has to genuinely be remorseful or sorry.
Mm-hmm.
They have to admit that what they did was wrong, and that they were responsible, and that
Right.
you know, they feel bad about it, right? And that's at the moment in which forgiveness can happen. And if that remorse is not there, then, you know, it doesn't work.
Right.
And so this is so, you know, when I talk about this with students in my classes, in a variety of ways, people are really skeptical, right? One, on the one hand, because you were saying, I think that it's so ingrained in us, this idea of crime and punishment, right? And as you point out, this is a feature of justice systems going back, you know, tens of thousands of years.
Right.
And so to think about this kind of equation in a different way is complicated, at least. And, you know, a lot of the examples that we have of restorative justice are either, you know, from um, outside of the United States, like South Africa or Rwanda, right? And in both of those cases, right, the process of reconciliation was grounded in some deeply kind of indigenous ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
The notion in South Africa, right, of Ubuntu, and then
Yep.
in Rwanda, they revived a certain kind of tribal court system to be able to do a lot of the reconciliation, right? When you see this kind of stuff happening in North America, it's in a lot of cases there's a lot of sort of American Indian or Indigenous First Nation groups that are doing this, particularly like in Canada, they have these tribal courts or restoration courts or things like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the example of what's going on in California with these neighborhood courts, this reform that took place a few years ago, this is a really sort of different kind of thing. But the examples, right, the long and short of it is the examples of this kind of stuff often seem very foreign to most, you know, white dominant
Right.
Americans, and that they feel like, look, if people aren't punished, if people aren't being hurt, then something is not being done right in the criminal justice system. So, um,
It's a very vengeful sort of
you know,
view. And that's mostly what I worry about. Because if we're getting into vengeance, if we're getting into an eye for an eye, I have strong concerns about whether or not that's justice or not, you know,
yeah,
or
and
if that's the kind of justice that a society wants or needs.
yeah, and you know, and what I often try to tell people is like, you know, when we talk about vengeance, which is, you know, this kind of this notion of like, you know, you hurt me, I'm going to harm you. That even like the Code of Hammurabi and like the eye
Mm-hmm.
for an eye, those were attempts to try to like, you know, keep that vengeance in place, right? So I often say, look, you know, vengeance is one thing, and vengeance is very destructive and very dangerous. Um, but you know, the kind of criminal justice in which we talk about crime and punishment, that was an attempt to try to like limit that, right? Because if you
Right.
think about eye for an eye,
It
the
just keeps
idea,
going.
yeah, well, the idea being that, you know, if I take out your eye, right, the sort of vengeful thing is, you know, I'm going to take as much as I can. I'm really going to fuck you up,
Mm,
because that's the sort of emotional reactions. You want to hurt someone.
right.
Um, but the eye for an eye is like, no, 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 no. I and I, it's an equation, right? And all of these justice systems are about this kind of trying to proportion out the harm. So you can only take out the eye if someone takes out your eye. You don't get to kill them and break their leg and kill their spouse and burn their
Right.
house, right? Just the eye. And so it is different from vengeance, but it's still a little bit like vengeance.
Right.
Now with these systems of transformative and restorative justice, we're sort of talking about how we don't want to talk about that aspect of the equation. We want to talk about these other ways. And I think for a lot of people, that's really confusing, because criminal justice means this kind of harm.
Punitive.
Yeah, this punitiveness, right? And so I wonder whether you think that we're at a moment in which we can seriously consider these kinds of alternatives.
Um, I always have faith in the human imagination. Uh, I think it's always possible to consider things, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the United States, if most of the population is open-minded enough yet, you know? If we look at the bills that have been recently passed by the Senate, given the moment that we're in, it's actually kind of surprising, right? That the Senate and the House would continue to pass bills to, allow police forces to have military equipment, or to allow DHS to just do whatever the heck they want. So I'm not sure. I sort of have faith in our ability to imagine a better future. I'm not sure if we're open-minded yet enough, because so much of this has come down to, I just think about that, the way that protesters are being portrayed by some of the more right-wing people, right? Violent anarchists have graffitied.
Right.
You in the same sentence you use violent anarchist and graffiti. It's just I don't know. I don't know if we're there, because there's so many voices coming and saying and trying to obscure the message, right?
Yeah, we're a very polarized and angry society right now. It's really hard to
Yeah,
trust one another, and I mean that's part of I mean, like the forgiveness process that Tutu is talking about. You have to get to a point where you're willing to be able to trust and forgive, and that only happened after everyone got really, really tired of killing each other.
right. And it's just, if we talk about defunding the police, it just makes a lot of sense to me, right? It's just sort of common sense things. Should a police officer have to take care of a mentally ill person? No, they shouldn't, because they're not trained that way, right? But because there's so much emotion and so much division, you can't even get people to listen long enough to realize, actually, maybe this makes a little bit of sense. So can we consider it? Do we have the ability to? Yes. Will it happen? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about that AP poll that I talked about at the beginning was that there's overwhelming support for a variety of different kinds of reforms, like cameras and changes in law to
Mhm.
like use of force policies and things like this. But then when you ask Americans, do you think that the police need to be defunded? Um, Large numbers say no.
Right,
So it seems very clear that police abolition is not on the table for most Americans.
right.
Defunding the police, not on the table for most Americans.
Mm-mm.
But substantial kinds of reforms to policing, they would consider that kind of stuff. And so, the kinds of things about transformative justice, right? The thing about how do we prevent violence in the first place by changing society to make it more caring and to be able to have the systems in place to take care of one another. That's a big ask already, right? As you were
Right,
pointing out, right, just last week, right, the Senate was trying to negotiate whether or not they would limit the amount of military grade hardware that would go to police forces. And as you point out, right, they weren't able to agree upon this. And so that stuff can still go to police departments, right, around the country. The House consideration, I understand, didn't have anything about that kind of limit. So, right, our
right,
politicians can't think about this. And the other sort of really big thing here is that, as we've talked about, so many of the crimes that we're talking about here, nonviolent crimes, property crimes, and things like this, are the result of cracks in the mental health system, problems of unemployment and poverty, housing, right? And so there would be so much that we need to sort of shore up just to get to transformative justice, that it seems as though the willpower to deal with like the inequality in our social safety net is not there either. And maybe that will
right.
change now with the pandemic. I don't know. I'm still wondering whether or not we're going to talk about inequality once the economy really starts to tank. because
Yeah.
so many people, right, you know, what 40% of Americans are not going to be able to pay their mortgages or their rents in the next few months, right? What is this going to look like? And are we going to start to talk about economic inequality? And it seems as though that until we start to really seriously do with that, and the barriers to that, namely politicians who have no interest in changing our economic system,
Right.
a lot of this stuff is going to be stalled.
Right. You know, when we talk about systemic oppression and systemic sort of, uh, the word is now escaping me, but you know what I mean. The differences
Yeah.
across economics and all these sorts of things that add into crime. I always think of that quote from Thomas More, right? What can be understood that first you make thieves and then you punish them,
Mm.
right? How much of crime in the United States is our own making? Because we can't figure out how to how to build a society that takes care of one another. How many crimes are committed every day because we can't figure that out, right? So I mean it's very concerning to me. And as you point out, you know, we're sort of talking about prison reform, but you can't get good prison reform without sort of taking in all these other issues too, right? Bail
Mm.
and what actually happens in prisons, right? The torture that happens in prisons, police brutality, racial bias within the justice system, all these sorts of things all are nebulous around this, so such that you're never going to get prison reform if you are simply thinking about prison reform. If you're simply thinking about, I need to reduce the number of incarcerated individuals, you're not going to get there if that is the only thing, right? And I somehow think we're going to come back to this every week is like, we as a society have to start thinking about what does it mean to be a society? What kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to be? Um, and it's not until we start to consider those things that we'll really start to make headway on a lot of these problems because they're all connected. They're all sort of little pieces of the same major cancerous tumor that needs to be cut out of America, right?
Yeah, no,
So,
that's a really good point. I think it is a big it has the problem has so many tentacles, and how do we get to it all? I mean, one of the ways that critical resistance talks about this is to say that, you know, their model of dismantle, change, and rebuild is that it's not sequential. You don't have to do
right.
this in that order, but that you can try to do little bits of each of it here and there, and working together, maybe that does something. So you dismantle some things, you try to change things here, and then also you work for rebuilding. And maybe the rebuilding is part of the imagination, right, of thinking differently, right? So the kind of imaginative work that we've been talking about with this film, maybe that's a part of the equation. Is we got to figure out, like, how do we generate the conversations that will provide the alternatives, and what does that mean, and what's lacking now for us?
Right. And the other thing I guess I was thinking about with this film, I know we're probably running short on time, but you know, this isn't that far into the future. We're already seeing programs where they want to release people with ankle monitors, right?
Right.
And I know that it's not as cool or scientific or like high tech as like an eye implant or an implant in the brain, but there's not a lot of difference between an ankle monitor and what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah.
So already these sorts of things are happening, and on top of that, there's people who are wanting to profit off of that, which
Right.
is problematic in and of itself, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. No, that's right. That's right. Well, this is a good point to end, right? I think, to sort of think that there's much more to sort of think, much more to imagine, and the interconnections of all of these problems is going to probably, as you point out, a big focus in our discussions going forward. So, well, thanks a lot for your time, Robyn. This was cool again.
yeah, you know, I we used to just sit and talk for hours in your office anyway, so it's
Right.
nice to be able to do the same thing.
Cool. Well, and to all of you who are watching and listening in, thanks once again for tuning in to Future States Focus. I want to say appreciate your time. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave us some comments down below, or you can send us an email to our website, which is anarresproject.org. You can also contact us through a variety of different social media platforms. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel here and get a sense of some of the other episodes and some of the other work that we do through the Anarres Project. Check out some of our other videos. But we hope that you will be able to have an opportunity to engage with us once again. So until next time, Robyn, thanks very much.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye.